Welcome to Recovering Evangelicals, a podcast for people who were once very comfortable in the Christian faith until the 21st century intruded and made it very hard to keep on believing. I'm your host, Luke Jansen.
And I'm Scott Dyer.
In the first two chapters of the first book of the Bible, Genesis chapters 1 and 2, written by humans inspired by meditation on the study of God, we have a story of a creator making the cosmos and all life on this planet, often making new things out of pre-existing and less organized materials, crystallizing light out of the darkness and land from the waters of the deep primordial oceanic earth, then urging the land to produce plants, and a bit later on telling the land to produce animals. And then God takes special care to produce humans, again using pre-existing materials, either mud taken from the land or, later, a rib that came from someone made from mud. And then God leaves those humans in charge of the planet, telling them to take care of the plants and animals and to get along, love each other, have sex and multiply, and enjoy the garden. In another book, also written by humans who are also inspired by the same author of the book of Scripture, but this one drawn from meditation on and study of nature, the book of Science, we have a similar story. A story of a cosmos and a planet evolving also out of a dark, formless universe, and on that planet, life and ecosystems evolving again out of a dark primordial ocean, a muddy mixture of light energy and minerals from rocks again producing plants, and later producing animals and eventually humans. And those humans develop the ability to dominate the planet and the potential to take care of the planet, a global garden, and to love each other and get along. Both stories are often portrayed as ending in abysmal failure, but both stories include a ray of hope, the possibility that it could have a happy ending, perhaps with a little divine help. Another thing that can be said about those two stories, they're often pitted as being in conflict, but I think they can be complementary, telling one unified story from different perspectives. What do you think, Scott?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, actually, the parallels. Now, I'm not saying, as some would argue, and we've talked about on this podcast, that the Genesis author of Genesis had some sort of scientific insight, some sort of divine insight scientifically. However, it demonstrates that kind of intuitively as human beings, we recognize that the cosmos, there is a chaotic side to this world we find ourselves in, right? There's this,
Right, yeah.
right? And a challenge for us to somehow tame it. In order to exist on this planet, we have to survive. And to survive, we need to mold creation to our needs, right? And so I think that's clear in the Genesis account. And it's also clear in what modern science is discovering. And then also, like you've touched on, the whole issue of the care for creation and the fact that, we're now in a position where we've caused some things to occur, like global warming and so on, that have huge worldwide implications.
Now, both stories involve things arising out of pre-existing things. I mean, let's face it, you can read Genesis as a story of evolution. Christianity has long had a very conflicted relationship with that theory of evolution. When Charles Darwin published his iconoclastic proposal on the origin of species, a large fraction of the scholars who are actually doing the basic science on which the theory was founded, and of the ones defending the merits of the theory, a large fraction of all those experts would have identified as Christian believers. Of course, when I say a large fraction were in favor of the theory, it goes without saying that some fraction were not. Many of us have heard about the debate between the biologist Thomas Henry Huxley and the Anglican bishop Wilberforce the year after Darwin published his book, and the zinger that Wilberforce lobbed at Huxley when Huxley made a reference to common descent from apes. He mockingly asked whether it was through Huxley's grandfather or your grandmother that you claim descent from the monkeys. Which, by the way, shows that the Anglican bishop really didn't understand what the theory actually claims or how it works. As for the non-experts at that time, the people in the church pews, there was also a mixed response. I'm not enough of a historian to say how many of them accepted the idea, but my intuition tells me that among those in the pews, the larger fraction were against it. I've read and heard enough to know that there was a very strong public response against the theory, and I think many of our listeners have seen images from newspapers at that time of Charles Darwin's head on the body of an ape. And I've included one famous version of that image in the header of our show notes for this episode. You obviously have seen it too, Scott.
Yeah, for sure. It's interesting, that whole area of how it was accepted by who and so on. actually kind of says a lot about various movements during that period. The mainline denominations seem to accept it more readily than the less mainline denominations, and then also I think much more accepted in Europe than in America.
Right.
America, yeah, in America particularly. And then, of course, we have the example of the famous Scopes trial in the U.S. So, yeah, it was quite a varied reaction. And there's another side to it as well that maybe isn't discussed quite as much, but it was very well accepted amongst a lot of, especially colonialists, because it really fit in with their colonialist narrative, that the colonized countries were somehow, they were savages and they were maybe not as evolved as civilized Europe. It fit that narrative quite well, too.
So if I'm understanding you right, you're referring to Britain and India, for example. You're not talking about American and the indigenous peoples here, are you?
No, more the British colonial kind of
Right.
interest. But in America, you also have the example of the eugenics movement, which was pretty popular at one time, and that was also supported by a form of Darwinism. So the implications of Darwinism socially are pretty massive, on all sides.
Right. So that was 200 years ago, folks, 1860, and we all know that the Christian community is still very divided on the theory of evolution.
Hmm.
We've all heard about polls done by Pew and Gallup and many other agencies and how they find that a third of Americans believe that humans have existed in their present form since the beginning of time.
And it's definitely a very different issue in America, as as a lot of issues are, than it is for example, in Europe.
And those polls were done in the past few years. We're not talking 50 years ago. This is just even in the past few years. So the non-acceptance of that idea of human evolution is still an important issue. We talked about that in our most recent episodes on young earth creationism.
Yeah, and I think there's also a growing concern among advocates within Islam, the attitude toward evolution in Islamic circles, because of course they have a kind of an increasing influence, in the
Right.
West.
Yeah.
And generally, I believe it's similar, that you do have some that manage to accommodate it, but a good number that don't.
Now, I don't know about the Islamists, but at least amongst Christians in
Right.
general and evangelicals in particular, they have two main problems with the theory. First, that it contradicts what they call a plain reading of the Bible, especially the first chapter of Genesis. So basically, it's about scriptural inerrancy and infallibility.
Right.
And the second problem with the theory of evolution has to do with human evolution, much more so than evolution of mere plants and animals, for all kinds of reasons. Not just inerrancy and infallibility, but especially the whole created in the image of God idea. Humans have to be seen as distinct and specially, differently, more intentionally created. Christians, evangelicals also have problems with the suffering and evil that they associate with the process of struggling for survival.
And the crux of the issue, maybe this is a better way to put it, the crux of the issue with evolution for religious people, evangelicals in particular, is that it strikes at, like you mentioned, our humanness. Like it strikes at, what about the soul? Did it evolve? There's a feeling that you're making us something less than what we are as image bearers.
But I did see it even, for example, in our own
Well,
audience.
in our own audience, yes, but I don't know if that's a good sample.
It may not be. I think I know why you're saying that, but then let me tell the story, especially for our listeners who haven't heard the story. Some of them have come on in the past half year or so. We had been doing a series of episodes. This goes back a couple of years where we were just looking at the evolution, the origin and evolution of dot dot dot. And
Right,
so we talked about the origin and evolution of the universe. We talked about the
right.
origin and evolution of life, about species in general, a lot of evolution, and even evolution of the Bible and some of the theological concepts. And during that whole time, we saw that we were getting a growing audience, and we had a steady, smooth. It wasn't an exponential rise, but we were getting a rise. It was nice and smooth.
Hmm.
But then we did 2 episodes on specifically human evolution, and we saw that we lost a large chunk of our listening audience. And I know that because we track our numbers, and the graphs that our analytics give us show this nice smooth rise over the course of dozens of episodes before and during that miniseries. But on those 2 weeks when we did human evolution, our numbers took a major dive, and it took a long time, months, to rebuild to our previous numbers and resume our climb upward.
Yeah, no, it is very interesting, and I think something's going on there, and it seemed to have struck a chord. I guess how I would maybe put it, and maybe you would put it differently, is I don't. This is just in my own experience of talking to various people in the evangelical side of things about evolution. In my experience, I don't see them differentiating between. I'm okay with Darwinism with everything but humans. I've never heard that distinction, but where they get most excitable or whatever, or the problem that they have with evolution is the human side of it. It's not the animal side of it. They really don't care about that. It's the implications for our humanness. That's where they have their problem. So when we start talking about specifically the human implications of it, the implications for our belief about, for example, things like original sin and stuff like that, then it starts to get a lot more uncomfortable.
At that time, when we saw that drop, at first I found it hard to accept. But I did accept when I realized if that's where those people get off the bus, then at least now I know who the audience is.
Right.
And when I look at it that way, I stop worrying about offending certain listeners because before that point, I would wonder, should we do a topic on prayer? Because there might be some people that might,
Mm,
and I did worry, but now I realize, okay, now I know who our listeners are, and I can be more honest with them and honest with them about where we are at, where I'm at.
right.
We may never have as big of an audience as podcasts that still try to hang on to the more conservative end of the spectrum. I don't need to name names. That's really not the
Yeah.
point. But broadly speaking, they're the podcasts that want to emphasize that accepting modern science or even new ideas in theology, that does not mean that Christians need to change their theology. I think we Christians do have to change our theology.
Right.
And I'll often point out that Christianity has taken many theological U-turns over the past 2,000 years.
Mm,
And so I'm a lot less skittish now about pushing back on the boundaries, in
right.
case you hadn't noticed. But at least now we produce something unique that's more tailored to an esoteric audience, listeners
Right.
who are still open to challenging dogma.
Right.
Are
Yeah.
you willing to challenge dogma, Scott?
All the time.
Good, good.
No, and I think that any theologian worth their salt, that's the history of Christianity, is the history of struggling with various ideas,
Right,
whether you call it dogma or what, dogma are just ideas that are inflexible or that people believe are inflexible. That's what it's come to mean. It's not a dirty word in some sectors. I mean, I have a 13-volume set of Karl Barth's Church Dogmatics. He wasn't afraid to call it that because dogma in the theological sense is simply the things that we believe,
yeah. And you
and
said 20 volumes?
no, 13, but
13 volumes. That's a lot of dogma.
it's the largest theological work I think in Christendom. And not only that is it, but the volume, they're massive volumes, and not only that, they have two different font sizes. So you'll often have like a paragraph in a regular font, and all the rest of it will be in this reduced like 8-point font. So it's like super condensed, and that's kind of more the notes, I guess. But they're by many considered more important than the main text. I forget how many words it is, but it is massive, and I
And
think that.
how can something that big not go out of date? And I'm not trying to make a joke, but
Oh
seriously,
no,
like you sit down and write that much material that you call dogma,
yeah.
how can that not go out of date?
Well, it can. And in fact, Bart, in his later years, he said something about, how he had lived to see the rise kind of interest and so on in his ideas and the eclipse. So that, that he had lived to see both. And yeah, oh no. Now, having said that, he's a very important theologian to dialogue with, and his writings are still very influential, but not in the sense that he's a dialogue partner, not that people are reading them to say this is the way it is. You know what I
Right.
mean? Yeah, it's kind of like Aquinas, I suppose. The same way that we interact with him. Yeah.
Oh,
Anyway.
okay. So that's theologians. Let's get back to you and
Yeah,
me and the audience.
yeah.
We have been talking a long time, and our listeners have been thinking a lot about evolution, and we seem to think that we're all quite on board with the idea, and we've incorporated it. I've largely incorporated it into my theology. But that having been said, I still see some hesitations or even pushback when I put all my cards on the table
Right.
and I talk to listeners about how human evolution fits into Christian theology. I'm not convinced that all Christian believers who claim they're okay with the general theory of evolution have completely thought through the implications, much less signed off on those. And I find that a substantial number among them claim they're completely open to the idea of evolution, but they nonetheless draw a line at certain points in the journey from animals to humans.
Right.
And they may not even be aware that they're doing this until someone like me explicitly points out where they might be doing this.
Right. Right. Yep.
So let's talk about those lines in the sand that people think they're crossing, but I'm wondering. When you look at them more closely, it's actually a series of lines, very close together in the sand. I've often referred to humans climbing up the evolutionary ladder and emphasizing that we can look at that evolutionary ladder from several different angles. Two of those angles aren't really so much of a problem for regular listeners of this podcast. I mean, everyone who's accepted that humans evolved will agree that we're obviously referring to evolution in the biological and the cognitive sense. Biologically, we came from lower life forms, from single cells, from aquatic animals, and all kinds of now long extinct land animals. And cognitively, in our thinking, our ancestors progressed through ever increasing levels of intelligence and behaviors. Controlling fire, creating weapons, painting on cave walls, building structures, and carving statues. We've got a mountain of fossil evidence and genetic evidence for biological and physiological changes, and a mountain of artifacts attesting to the cognitive changes and technological advances. So no problems there. Our listeners have crossed those two closely spaced lines in the sand, just like you and I. For some believers who accept human evolution, this is probably as far as they've thought about the question when it comes to that term, human evolution, and the term climbing up the ladder. But human evolution has been going on in other ways as well. There are other lines in that sand, and we've been talking about them recently. In addition to evolving biologically and cognitively, we've been evolving in a spiritual and a religious sense. And this is the point at which some of our listeners start to squirm. For some of them, that's because they haven't actually thought about how, in the process of primitive hominids evolving cognitively, that cognitive evolution is going to involve ideas and even neural wiring that prepares our mind for theological ideas and spiritual encounters. That's what we talked about with Dr. Chris Berger a few weeks back. And we've discussed in some detail the whole idea of the evolution of a religious streak in humans in episodes 77 and 78, and evolution of the Old Testament in 57, of Judaism itself in 80, of the New Testament in 81, and the evolution of the concept of Jesus as the Jewish Messiah in 82, and a cosmic divine being in 83, and the evolution of the uniquely human emotion of awe a couple months ago in episode 151. So this is the aspect of human evolution that I think some of our listeners still are a bit hesitant about. They may be nodding, but they're thinking hard about it and evaluating whether they should be nodding or not. They feel a little bit conflicted inside. They still have some trouble crossing this line. And to be clear about this, what this line is, on the one side of the line is a view that Jewish thinking was suddenly handed down to humans at Mount Sinai, a very Judeo-Christian focused perspective on the question. And on the other side of that line, human theology and spirituality has been developing for millennia, Judaism and Christianity along with the other world religions, as humans began to wrestle with the concepts of death and ancestry and communal living. By that last point, I'm getting at how humans had to really change their thinking when they transitioned from being wandering hunter-gatherer groups of 20 to 50 people to communities of farmers and traders settling in cities of hundreds or even thousands. And Chris talked to us about that a couple weeks ago in episode number 156. So that's one of the closely spaced lines I'm talking about, right next to the two lines we've already mentioned. Everyone sees those two other lines more clearly than this third one, but then there's a fourth line, very close to the third one. And here, even more of our listeners, including atheists in my audience, all of whom otherwise claim to be completely okay with human evolution, now a few more begin to hesitate and squirm. This line is about humans climbing up the evolutionary ladder in a moral and ethical sense. It's at that point that some of them suddenly snap their heads up, maybe even take a step back and raise counter-arguments to that claim. And often those pushbacks include references to dropping nuclear bombs 50 years ago, and the many genocides and wars of the 20th and 21st centuries. This even came up in our discussion a month or so ago, Scott, episode 150, when you and I and Professor Andrew Torrance, all three of us, self-identifying Christians who accept the theory of evolution, and yet there was that, again, that reference to genocides and dropping nuclear bombs.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
What I've also got to say is kind of funny for those other people who aren't quite comfortable with the idea of humans climbing up the moral ladder. I think this betrays a worldview, conscious or not, that humans had some kind of morality in some long distant past and that we've been sinking lower and lower in a moral sense. And for some, they see humans progressively moving towards some apocalyptic self-destruction. And so I think it's funny that they can envision humans growing gradually through various ancestral biological and cognitive levels rather than suddenly appearing in fully formed 10,000 years ago, and yet be unable, or at least hesitant, to agree with the idea that our ancient primitive human ancestors might do the exact same thing in a spiritual religious sense, climbing up gradually into a greater awareness of this aspect of our existence, and especially again when we climb up the ladder in a moral/ethical sense. So, in other words, they're perfectly able to let go of a 6-day creation story when it comes to biology and cognitive evolution, but they can't let go of the pilgrimage to Mount Sinai story and wandering through the desert for 40 years to account for spiritual and moral evolution.
Right. Yeah. So the idea that what I'm hearing here is the idea that, in a sense, our theology or our religious tendencies have also evolved. And along with that, morality. I think the discomfort probably would be that people feel that that is a reductionist, that it's basically saying that this just happened kind of, naturally, not because of any sort of divine spark in humans and so on, but just that it's just something that evolves naturally along with the biological evolution and so on.
Okay. I think you
I,
may
that
come.
that that that's what I would suspect is the discomfort that people have, but I'm only surmising that.
Yeah. And how about yourself, if you don't mind me asking?
Oh, well, yeah, I think there is an immediate, because the tendency as a kind of a theologian is to see these things as, like I said, a divine spark or something that is specially created within us, right? Not something that comes about through natural processes. But having abandoned that natural process versus that whole way of looking at things, I don't have a problem with it now, but I can understand where people are coming from. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the question then. Why is this important? Why do I keep hammering on about this?
Right. Right.
Here's why I'm being so persistent on this point about humans evolving and climbing up the evolutionary ladder. Whether one believes that there is a preordained meaning behind the universe, that the universe was designed and created for a purpose, or you don't believe in that kind of teleology, in other words, whether you're a believer or an atheist, either way, I think that humans nonetheless do have or should have a purpose on this planet. Whether you're a theist, a believer or not, we've kind of inherited that purpose, either because it's been given to us or because it's only right that we take on this responsibility. And our purpose, our responsibility is to take care of the planet.
Right.
And there's two versions of, my rationale for this. The non-theist version of that point is that we are the one species on Earth that has evolved to the point that we can not only inhabit every corner of the planet, but we can also change and influence every ecosystem for better or for worse. And we do so at will, guided by our knowledge, our science, and our technology. Many other species have become able to reach and inhabit every corner of the globe. I'm thinking plants and insects, mice and birds. And some of those have become able to change the planet. Bacterial algae, for example, completely changed the planet 2 billion years ago by learning how to use sunlight to split water and produce oxygen as a waste product. Oxygen was barely detectable before that, and now oxygen makes up 1/5 of the air we breathe. And that obviously radically changed Earth's atmosphere, and it catalyzed all kinds of chemical changes in Earth's rocks and minerals. They began to rust and decay, but it also set the stage for larger multicellular forms of life. That's just one example of species that have changed the planet, but we've have a unique ability of changing the planet.
Yeah. And I agree with that. So maybe you could expand that a little bit. So wherein does that uniqueness lie?
It lies in our brains, our science, and our technology.
No, but I mean, how is it different from the fact, like you mentioned, that the oxygen producing, is it
Yeah. Okay.
bacteria, the archaea? Is that the archaea that we're talking about there? Or?
I no, it would have been the blue
Oh,
green algae that did that.
oh, okay, okay.
Yeah.
But massive biological events that have completely reshaped the planet, right?
Right.
In,
Yes.
in a way that's favorable to life, but nonetheless, global effects.
Right.
Yeah.
Well,
So how's that different? How would you differentiate that between humans also changing the environment in a global way?
I think the key difference is that we can do this at will. We can expand our repertoire of abilities when needed. We've developed the ability to eradicate other species and to rescue them from extinction, the ability to destroy whole ecosystems and to protect them, the ability to divert massive rivers and cause floods and drain and pollute lakes, or to manage water systems and conserve them, to develop chemicals and medicines that hurt people and ones that help people. I could go on, but you get the point. We have this unique ability, which I think then confers on us a unique responsibility, and we need to learn how to wear that well.
Yeah, like I guess what you're kind of more or less saying, I think, is the acceleration. Like as nature changed over billions of years, the planet could handle that because the change was very gradual and evolution could continue and absorb it and so on. But now humans can do in 50 years what may have taken a billion years of evolution, right?
Right. Yeah.
And the planet cannot handle that kind of rapid change. We can't evolve fast enough. We're able to do things that the natural processes can't. And then I guess to add to that, we very much could bring about the end of life,
Right.
which it seems unlikely that just the natural evolutionary process would have brought the end of all life, but we could do that.
But fortunately, I think we also have the potential, if we can get our act together, we have the potential to take steps back and to recover from what we've done.
Yes,
So the bottom line is, I think we humans, I'm speaking now from a non-theist point of view, we humans have
right.
become the adults in the room. We have to take care of the planet because we have that unique ability to both be positive or negative forces in this.
There's an interesting congruence here with it's one of the few times maybe within theology and secularism that there's kind of a congruence. We both kind of agree for whatever reasons. You can say, well, the theist can say it's because God created us and so on and so forth. The atheist can say, well, it's because of evolution. It doesn't, in a sense, almost matter. The
That's right.
reality, we both agree on the fact that humans are kind of the keepers of creation. So you think on that level, we could at least have some pretty fruitful dialogue.
Yeah. And that's where I was going with this. That's why I told at the beginning the story of these two different stories of how things came to be on Earth. We've got the Genesis chapters 1 and 2 story, and then we've got the book of nature story. And I did portray them as walking in parallel. They're complementary. And I'm leading to this point that whether you're a non-theist, I still say we are in charge of the planet. We've got a responsibility. But now as a theist, especially a Christian theist, I can make the same point.
Yeah,
God created humans along with the rest of the animals and plants, and he said, "Okay, kids, I'm leaving you in charge. You're my representatives, my ambassadors." That whole made in the image of God thing. He's and just love each other and enforce rule number one on all the species, which is just be fruitful and multiply and enjoy the garden.
right. Yeah, I think that, I mean, obviously from my biased Christian perspective, we've got even better reasons because we believe that nature is a creation of a divine presence. It's inherently valuable, which I don't know how the other side, the materialists, I don't know, I'm not sure how they would just, and I'm not saying that they can't come up with something, but certainly on the Christian side, we believe there's inherent value in creation. And this is something, by the way, that in the ancient world was not true. I mean, especially amongst the Greeks. Greek philosophy and so on looked very much down on creation, that the
Well,
creation,
to be clear, because you and I
yeah,
both have some understanding of Greek theology, philosophy, they just had a negative view of matter, that it
right.
was our goal as spirit beings to escape matter. That's what they hated. It's not that they
Yeah.
hated creation, they just didn't hate, they hated being material.
Okay, but it's not a far stretch. Yeah, you know what I mean.
Right.
So
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, I get it.
anyway, so I think that Christian theism in general is very affirmative of this world. It's a very worldly religion, even though many of its expressions have been so otherworldly. I think
Right.
that's an aberration.
And I would say then, Scott, I also see that in indigenous religions, they're very much pro-creation,
Yep.
in love with creation. And a
Yeah.
lot of other religions are very much I think it's inherent in us as humans and
I think it is. And I think that it's also partly that in many cases on the indigenous side, they live closer to it. Western man has, because of I see it as an aberration, but this idea of we're not the custodians of creation, we're the conquerors of creation. That's been very deadly, obviously, and has led in a lot of ways to the kind of the mess we're in. On the other hand, indigenous groups seem to be much more custodial, that
Yeah,
because they depend on it, right? So they know that they can't ruin the thing that they depend on.
we can learn a lot from them.
Yes, we can.
But we should move on. So here's the thing. Here's why I wanted to finally do today's episode. We've been long talking about humans evolving to become the dominant species of the planet. And I've often mentioned how humans have developed or been given a godlike ability to change everything on the planet. And so we can now finally fulfill that first divine command, or moral responsibility if you want to be a non theist about this point, to take charge and manage the planet, to be the divine representative made in God's image. But whenever I push that idea, I get pushed back. That essentially amounts to the only thing that humans can be counted on to do is to screw things up. I personally think that we humans have done some amazing things with our technologies, good things, like bringing species back from near extinction, protecting species that are threatened, coming up with a cure for a facial cancer that threatens to eliminate the Tasmanian devil, or put up a hedge of protection around the Galapagos Islands. We have the potential to do so much good if we can just harness our more primitive urges. We're like teenagers trying to navigate the transition from childhood to being grown up adults. That's notoriously a difficult stage. Ask any parent, and we've been at that stage for about 500 years. We just need to get past that awkward stage of uncontrolled emotions coupled with unlimited powers. And so I've been long wanting to do an episode looking closely at this evolution of human morality and ethics. I just haven't felt that we were quite ready. Neither our audience nor you and I, Scott. I thought neither of us are scholars in this area. I mean, I'm the scientist between the two of us, so I can speak with confidence about that side. And I always defer to you, Scott, when it comes to the philosophy and theology side of things. Although I'll admit I give you some vigorous pushback sometimes.
No, yeah.
But neither of us are really scholarly experts in philosophy nor theology, and especially not of ancient human history. And we
Right.
want to bring in an A-list scholar here, someone who can give an informed perspective on the growth and evolution of morality and ethics. And it took me a while to look around for a great candidate, and I did find one, but you won't hear from him today. Our conversation with him is going to cover a lot of ground, 5 or 10,000 years of human history, and the growth and evolution of our philosophy and theology during that time. That's a long discussion. Here we are already at I think, the 45-minute mark. So instead, we're going to use this episode to cover some foundational material so that we don't lose too much time on that next week when we talk to our guest expert. So one very important element of that foundation will be human history itself over the past 50,000 years. We covered that in detail 4 years ago in episode number 6, way back at the beginning of this podcast. We talked about humans evolving in Africa, then migrating into Europe and Asia via the land bridge that connects the continents, which just happens to be in the region where you find Egypt and Israel, and the land that the ancient Babylonian Empire ruled over, what we now call modern-day Iraq and Turkey. All of this migration and empire building at precisely the time that we humans were unpacking that religious streak that we had evolved in Africa. A couple of weeks ago, we were talking to Dr. Chris Berger about this, and in that conversation, he was summarizing some work from two high-profile anthropologists. Again, I mentioned this a few minutes ago. One anthropologist was talking about the timeline when humans transitioned from being wandering hunter-gatherer tribes of about 50 in Africa and became farming trading communities in large cities in the Levant region, and how that societal change was a catalyst for some profound lawmaking and religious evolution. It's no coincidence that the world's oldest religions trace their roots to this time and this place. Those oldest religions being the Egyptian and Babylonian empires and their religions, and the Jewish and Zoroastrian religions. All of this history about humans migrating out of Africa and developing world religions in the Levant region, this is all core for our discussion next week with our invited guest. But that conversation with Chris was not enough preparation, so I've got some homework for our listeners. Go back and listen again to episode number 6, where we did all of that in detail. I guarantee you that doing so will make it easier for you next week. It'll put all those empires and religions and evolutionary developments into perspective, into a time frame. But there's one other part of our human history that is absolutely essential for what we talk about next week. I'm sure many of our listeners will have heard and read a bit about the various ages in human history, things like, Stone Age, the Bronze Age, the Dark Ages, the Enlightenment, and many other major periods in human history. But I'm guessing that very few of our listeners have ever heard of something called the Axial Age. And Scott, I'm hoping that you've heard about this.
I have, but mainly in passing. But yeah.
Tell us what you know.
Yeah, yeah, it's a fascinating idea that there's this kind of period that is from around 800 BCE to 200 BCE, around that time frame, where all of a sudden you see the emergence of thought patterns and ideas throughout the world. So, for example, in Greece, during that period, you have the birth of philosophy, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. India, you have various philosophical schools that emerged during that period, namely Buddhism and Jainism and so on. In China, you have the teachings of Confucius coming around that same period. In the Middle East, prophetic movements such as Judaism, Zoroastrianism. And so it's a very, interesting how these things are happening seemingly simultaneously in various parts of the world. And, you know, why? I mean,
Exactly.
that's a good question, right? Had we kind of evolved to a point that all of a sudden these kind of things start to naturally happen, I'm kind of reminded a little bit, although it is different, but in the world of science history as well, you kind of have that happening. For example, Leibniz and Newton both discover the calculus right around the same time independently, and the feeling is that the reason for that was because general knowledge had come to a point where someone was going to discover these things, right?
Right.
Somebody smart enough was going to come along and discover these things. And maybe there's a little bit of a parallel to that, where humans had come to a point. And what else is occurring during that time? Well, I think the major thing is agrarian, the idea of agriculture. And agriculture, as we've talked about, leads to civilizations, right? Because now all of a sudden people are living together in a way that they maybe hadn't as much in the past. And when that happens, it gives rise to things like religion and so on. So, yeah,
You mentioned, well, first of all, you mentioned all these things happening around the world, not just in Greece, but all around the world.
right.
And a lot of the things you mentioned were more religious and theological, philosophical in nature, but it was even science. This is when those Greeks were coming up with all those formulas, Pythagorean theorems, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's true.
The
Yeah.
Chinese inventing various weapons.
Yeah.
I was talking with a fellow, this was a few years back, and I forget how we got onto it, but we were talking about music. And he then mentioned, yeah, it's like in the axial age. And I said, what? And he explained, I can't repeat what he
Ah.
explained, but basically, those ancient Greeks in that period, they were figuring out how music works, how different frequencies, and the harmonics, I think they were even somehow aware of the waveforms and how,
Mm.
a third fits with a fifth, or, the major scale and
Yeah.
all these different scales.
Yeah.
It's just amazing
Yeah.
at that time in history, what was going on in the human mind, and that's what we're going to find next week with our expert.
It's always really one thing that's always really intrigued me is you have the pyramids in Egypt, but then you have the Incas building very similar structures a world away. Why is that?
Right.
Like that kind of stuff, right? And it seems like knowledge builds to a point in all these cultures where they begin to discover these things.
Now, another thing that we're going to talk about next week, and I'm saying it now because I want the listeners to hear it. Like I want them to have been cued to this so that they hear it next week when our guest expert talks about this. It's this whole idea that when I say that morality has been increasing, we can look at it, are we being less immoral or are we becoming more moral? Are we
Right.
seeing less negative things? For example, are we seeing less murders, less killings, hatred, and violence, or are we seeing more positive things?
Hmm.
Things that were completely absent in our societies just a few thousand years ago.
Right.
And so we'll be talking about, for example, what we see now are disaster relief efforts and peacekeeping missions, global distribution of food and medicines, protests against wars, against inequalities, a broader recognition of equality for people of other genders, other sexualities, other races. That was unprecedented. You just didn't see it a couple thousand years ago.
Hmm.
Attempts at rescuing ecosystems and protecting them. I could go on, but again, you see my point. We see
Hmm.
a lot more of all of these things and others in our current period of history when they were entirely absent in our more distant past. And we're seeing a lot of successes in those areas and yes, failures too, but it's a glass half empty, half full thing, or pessimism versus optimism. We're learning, we're flexing our moral muscles. So this is where I want to share some of our listener correspondence on this very topic. I asked them if we should do this, and there was a broad consensus that yes, we should do this episode. And here's one comment from one of our listeners, from Christine. She wrote, I think in some ways we are more moral. We don't permit unwanted newborns to be left in the street to die. We provide some health care for those who can't afford to pay. We value women, the disabled, different cultures and races more equally than in the past. But we also see technology that can harm many used too often. We're damaging our environment, and already air pollution kills as many people each year as the COVID-19 virus did the first year. So,
Well, this is the glass half full, half empty thing, right?
right,
Depending on the data you pick and so on, you can kind of see it both ways. However, I think one thing that she's hitting at there, where there is a fundamental change, is it's not just a quantitative thing. It's not just, well, how many people, and I know you're going to talk about this, die in war and things like that. It's not only that, it's also a sense of what ought to be, right? That we ought not do these things, that it's wrong to kill the disabled or kill innocent people or and so on and so forth. That, believe it or not, there were societies they didn't feel those things were wrong.
right.
They didn't
Well,
think
that's the
so.
point I want to be making,
Right.
that
Yeah.
we
And
have been becoming
yeah.
more moral in that way and many others.
Right. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. Yeah.
Okay. So you just mentioned something, Scott, that I do want to get into. I'm going to cue you and I want to cue the listeners as well. I've left links in the show notes for two graphs. One graph is looking at wars over the past, I think, 600 or 700 years. And then another graph that talks about the global population. So if you're keen, pull those out and take a look at these. But I want to first read a comment from another listener. And he asked a question that you asked a few moments ago, Scott. This one is from Robert. He said, looking at recent history, I'm thinking that it is a little hard to draw the conclusion that humanity is less murderous than we ever were. You only have to look at the number of people killed since 1900. Of course, our global population is greater than ever, so that further complicates the comparison. So that's what Robert said, and he makes a great point. And he's astute and honest enough to raise an important caveat. So let's look at the deaths due to major wars in the past while factoring in the global population at that time. And again, I've sent those links to those two graphs that you can look at while I'm doing this. A lot more people died in the First and Second World Wars in the early 1900s than died in the 30 Years' War of the early 1600s. But the global population in the early 1900s was 2 billion, while that in the 1600s was half a billion. And when you look at those deaths on a per capita basis, that's what's in that graph, all three wars had a death rate of 1,000 people per 100,000. I'll say that again. All three wars had a death rate of 1,000 people per 100,000. So that's another way to say that is a death rate of 1%. The global population is estimated to have been only 100 million in 500 BCE. You can see that in that graph that I also showed you there, and 27 million in 2000 BCE. Those are millions, not billions. With those population sizes and a predicted war death rate of 1%, one might anticipate 1 million deaths due to war. 1 million, the population of a small city in today's world. And remember that period in time, 2000 BCE to 500 BCE, that was a time in history when you had the Babylonian, Egyptian, Persian, Greek, and Roman empires all sweeping back and forth across the globe and trying to conquer the known world at that time. I think it's entirely reasonable to think that 1 million people died during all those wars. Let's go back a bit further in time, back in human history when there was only 1,000 of us on the planet. We were just the new kids on the block in evolutionary terms. At that time, you only needed to kill literally 10 people due to war to get the same death rate. For example, killing off all the able bodied males in just one of those migrating hunter gatherer tribes would have given the same death rate as World Wars I and II. And I'm sure that happened at least once back in those days. So adjusted on a per capita basis, the death rates of our biggest wars has not really changed from what it was 50,000 years ago. Or it might even be said that this death rate has been going down. Today, the global population is 8 billion, and that would predict 80 million people dying due to war, and we're just not seeing that. In fact, when you look at that graph, it shows the global deaths and war conflicts from the year 1400 to the present. It actually looks like the death rate over the past 50 years has dropped. And if you do check out the graph, again, there are links in the show notes. You have to notice that the y-axis is logarithmic. It's not linear, which means any rise or fall that you see in that graph is reflecting powers of 10. It's not linear.
Yeah. Well, I guess one question I have maybe is how do they come up with population numbers when you go way back? Is it just based on a certain statistical assumptions, kind of?
Well, it certainly would be assumptions, and yeah, I guess they would be statistical in nature, but exactly how they did it, I don't know.
No, but you feel they're pretty accurate. They're like they should be accurate enough.
Well, these are reputable institutions that don't really have a vested interest. They're just reporting what they think is a fact.
Sure. And what about numbers of deaths if from war when you go back? I wonder
Well,
how
again,
they.
I was careful to say, like, I don't know, and I didn't find any numbers on how many people died during when the Romans and Greeks and Babylonians
Yeah,
and
yeah,
Assyrians were going back and forth. But I said, if the population is as big as they thought it was, you only needed 1 million to have died in war, and at
right.
that time, I think 1 million is a very believable death count.
Yeah, yeah,
And
sure.
again, to restate the case, when you could then express that 1 million deaths as a per capita number,
Yeah,
it's the
right.
same death rate as the 30 Years' War in the 1600s and the
Yeah,
Second World
yeah.
War in the 1940s. The point is that we're not getting more murderous. Our numbers
No,
are going up,
no.
and I'm sorry to do this for a third time, but to make the point, it doesn't look like we've been becoming more murderous over time.
Right,
If anything,
right.
you might even, it kind of looks like we're getting a little bit less murderous, but
Yeah,
at the same time, we're also becoming more compassionate. We're doing all these peacekeeping missions, people protesting this in the streets against war, demanding equal rights for people. So we've been adding on the positive side and
right,
not increasing or maybe even decreasing on the negative side.
right.
So here's another listener comment. This one is from Edward, and I really appreciate not only what he wrote, but what he provided to our Facebook community. I left a link again in the show notes. He provided a link to a document that quantifies the increase in human rights. But let me first read Edward's comment here. He said, I would definitely agree with your claim. Look at the progress that has been made where genocide, slavery, colonialism are not the normal way of doing things anymore. The UN Declaration of Human Rights would never have been achievable before, particularly in the past where humanity lived in an era of scarcity and competition for basic resources. Although famines, disease, war are still with us, the vast majority of humans today enjoy far greater rights and privileges than humans had even just a few hundred years ago, let alone 3,000 years or 10,000 years ago, when most of humanity lived lives with zero rights and in either slavery or abject poverty, subject to the whims of those with power. This is still Edward writing. Perhaps it's not an upward climb, but a staggered, uneven journey with little bursts of progress and failures at different points in history, but a clear upward trajectory. However, the upward trajectory may not continue, particularly if we enter another era of scarcity due to some type of natural or man made catastrophe. I would not see this upward trajectory as inevitable, but requiring hard and dedicated work by all of us to make it happen. And then he said, let me also add quantitative analysis here so we don't rely on anecdotal evidence. And he's shared a link to this. It's not a UN document, but it is some nonprofit agency that took some kind of statistical method to quantify human rights. And you can see in there, human rights over the past several centuries, there is a substantial trend upwards. You have to look at their methods and see if you agree with that. But when you look at these graphs, they're clearly showing an upward rise in human rights over the past centuries. You've looked at it, Scott. What do you think?
Well, yeah, he makes some really, really good points there that I think are often overlooked. The very fact that, yeah, that the United Nations, for example, has this Declaration of Human Rights. I mean, that's just outrageous historically. Like that just would you can't can you imagine the Egyptian Empire, the Roman Empire?
Exactly. Yeah.
It's unfathomable, really.
Yes.
So it represents a new moral goal, a new moral ideal that really has not existed in the past. Say with the U.S. Constitution, the U.S. has a lot of problems, and it causes a lot of people to be very anti-American. I'm not one of them. I really believe that the founders in the US laid out some ideals that they believed in. They themselves didn't live up to those ideals. Some of them had slaves and so on. But by laying out that ideal, they gave a target, right?
Right.
Someone has said, the United States is not a country, it's an idea. And I think in a lot of ways that's very true. And so they're always struggling with reaching those ideals. But the fact is, they're struggling to reach those ideals. And that's a really good thing, right? They're not struggling frankly, they're not struggling in Russia to meet those kind of ideals. They're not struggling in China to meet those kind of ideals because they don't have them, right? And so I think that's a huge indicator of moral progress. Now, I also agree that it's not inevitable, and it's very much a staggered, we go up and then we go back and then we go
Right.
up, absolutely for sure. And, there's that famous quote Martin Luther King used to like to quote.
Scott, I know where we're going with this, but this is another listener comment, and I want to share what that listener, Merv, in this case, said.
Oh, okay.
He
All
was
right. You go.
he was, I think, responding to what Edward said about how this moral climb up the ladder is not a given. It's not inevitable. We have to work at it. And Merv wrote in, he said, I agree. My belief is that God's hope for this planet and this people is we work together to bend the arc of the moral universe towards justice. And of course, Merv is quoting Martin Luther King Jr. there. And so were you, Scott, just a second ago. MLK's speech, Remaining Awake Through a Great Revolution, was given at the National Cathedral in March of 1968, where he said, We shall overcome because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. The TV talk show host Jon Stewart added something important to those immortal words. Jon said, That arc may bend towards justice, but someone has to bend it,
Mhm.
while other people are pushing it back.
Right. Yeah, no, and by the way, Martin Luther King is quoting somebody there. It's
Oh,
not
I didn't
his,
know that.
yes, that's not his original quote. They always say all great art is theft. Well, but anyway, I love the quote. I've always loved it. But yeah, there is a sense that just going by that quote that it's a natural bending, right? That it just
Exactly.
naturally occurs. And no, we have to
Well,
bend.
no,
We
it's
have
not natural. That's the point that Jon Stewart's making. It's not
right,
a natural
exactly.
bend. People
That's
have
what
to bend
right.
it while other people are bending it back.
Exactly. That's exactly right. Yeah. So it's I think though underlying the quote I do think is kind of a teleological worldview that somewhere behind the scenes God is bending that moral arc as well. Like I think if you looked at it you'd find that. But both are, you can believe both, but we have to be the ones that bend it, and
Exactly.
certainly in the teachings of Jesus, you see that over and over again, that it's our responsibility not to just lay back and expect this to happen, that
Right.
we have, yeah, yep.
So, okay, Scott, we should soon call it quits, but I do want to do a little bit of self-promotion if the listeners will indulge me. I do this for the benefit of the listener, or at least some of them. And really, we don't do much of this. In fact, I can't remember if I've ever pushed my books on the show, but I do want to push this one because it's so directly relevant to what we're talking about. It's one of the books that I wrote, the second one, which deals directly with human evolution and the impact this idea has on Christian theology. I work from the assumption or the hope at least that if listeners like what they hear in the podcast, they'll check out who we are. They'll go to our podcast archive, and in the process, they'll find out that those books are there and that the second one is so relevant. But just in case, I want to point your attention to that. It focuses squarely on human evolution, and I've written it for the non-expert who needs even the basic science explained before we dive into the quicksand of theology. And so I'll explain the basics of fossilization and carbon-14 dating and genetics and a lot more. I think at the level that anyone who's gone to high school or watched documentaries on TV, they would understand. And then I walk through the catalog of hominid species that scientists have found, Homo erectus and Neanderthals, Australopithecus, Naledi, and about a dozen others, and that's only the first half of the book, or maybe three quarters. Then I dive deep down into the theology, the implications of accepting that body of evidence and the modern scientific interpretation of that evidence. So, again, as I said earlier, I do think that Christianity needs to adjust its theology. So, I get into a long list of heavy duty questions like original sin and atonement, the fall in general, calling ourselves fallen creatures, the concept of being created in the image of God, that's important if you're when you're talking about slavery and abortion and human sexuality and individual fertilization. I get into death and disease and the various genealogies. Why did Jesus die on the cross? The Noah's flood. A lot of big important theological issues and how they are affected by this science of human evolution. So I do recommend the book for anyone who's interested in the topic and how it impacts their theology. You can find links in the podcast website or just look on our main web page. You can search Amazon as well for Luke J. Jensen and the title "Standing on the Shoulders of Giants: Genesis and Human Origins." Shameless plug there, Scott.
Yeah, well, that's all right. Like you said, it's not like you've been done that very, very often. And
I don't think I've plugged a book yet. That's the first time that I can recall.
well, I'll put a plug in. I've read the books and they're great. I was even a little bit involved, I think, with one of them, helping just do some
Yeah.
editing and stuff like that. But yeah, no, I would certainly recommend our viewers check those out.
Okay. Okay, so next week we're going to talk to a scholar about this topic of humans climbing up the evolutionary ladder in the moral and ethical sense. Rabbi and Dr. Bradley Shavit Artson at the American Jewish University in Los Angeles. He has expertise in the relevant period of human history. I'm talking about the history and culture of the ancient Near East, again, the Levant, the part of the world that bridges Africa and Europe and Asia. In the description of his academic expertise and accomplishments, we find that he has long been a passionate advocate for social justice, human dignity, diversity, and inclusion, as well as cultural and religious dialogue and cooperation. And he's written extensively and spoke often on matters related to justice and ethics. And being a rabbi, he's also an expert on the Jewish religion, which, again, Scott, you were talking about the Axial Age. This is a product of the Axial Age. A lot of the Jewish texts were written at that time, and they're all about giving humans this moral/ethical guideline to help us up that ladder. And finally, one particular angle that I was surprised and intrigued to read about in Dr. Artson's CV is that he brings in process theology, the whole idea that God, or Yahweh, is also changing over time, responding to events in human histories. So it's going to be particularly cool to see how he brings that into our conversation about humans climbing up the moral ladder.
Absolutely. It's going to be a fascinating discussion.
So with that, don't forget to check out episode number 6, the detailed summary of human history during the biblical period. There's a link in the show notes, and stay tuned for next week's episode.
Can't wait.
You've been listening to Recovering Evangelicals with your hosts, Luke Jansen and Scott Dyer. Send your comments and suggestions for new episodes to lukejjansen@gmail.com. Join our private discussion group on Facebook by searching for the Recovering Evangelicals podcast group. Look for the logo that you always see at your favorite podcast catcher and ask to be let in. Subscribe to lukejjansen.wordpress.com if you want to get advanced releases and group posts, or browse through our archive for a full listing of all our previous episodes. And please help the podcast by sharing with a friend and leaving a review at your favorite podcast catcher.